Let me ask the panel members, if you would, please, to go ahead and come forward, and we will save some time that way, I think.
Oh, okay. Somebody's going to the restroom. So.
Yeah. Good plan.
It's great to see you. Have a seat. Make yourself comfortable. I'd like to make just a few very brief comments, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and we mainly want to hear from them. So my name is Neil Lane. I'm university professor at Rice. Been at Rice off and on for 40 years or so. I'm involved with the Science Technology Policy Program, and in doing so, I'm very privileged to work with George Abbey on space policy, which obviously is central to our science technology efforts. I also have the honor of serving as moderator for this distinguished panel on the benefits of international cooperation. I was late coming to this meeting. I apologize. I haven't had a chance to meet many of you. I was at a workshop in which many of our Chinese colleagues in another field were present, and of course the devastating earthquake in the Chengdu region hit, and we had much discussion about that. So I'd just like to note, I know our shared sympathies to the people of China who are suffering from the devastating consequences of this earthquake. I know that our Chinese colleagues who were invited here would very much like to be with us, but of course there are still some political issues between our two governments that sometimes get in the way, and I think all of us need to work as best we can in whatever ways we can to try to help remove those barriers. In these another case, of course, of devastation is the situation in Burma, which is terribly tragic as a result of the cyclone. You know, it's just clear to those of us who care about space, and I think most good people everywhere, that human life is a treasure. It's a treasure to be cherished on this earth, wherever the humans are and whatever their situations may be. So these disasters are terrible things. But in both these cases, international science and technology will, in time, we hope, give us better tools, better understanding to predict these events and help these societies cope with the disasters. We also need wisdom from governments in order to see that happen. This session is on the benefits of international cooperation. I think to most of us, certainly this audience, the benefits of international cooperation in space and many other areas related to science and technology are obvious. Maybe they should be examined more critically in time, as should everything else, all the other assumptions we make, but I think on the benefits side, they're clear. The success of the International Space Station, I believe, personally, and all these are my personal remarks, is an example of an unprecedented international partnership which many nations have shared knowledge, technical expertise, people, money, and risk. I was in the White House when Russia's Zvezda service module was launched. I remember it was a very exciting time to see that critical piece of the International Space Station up in orbit and the space station a reality. And I continue to watch with great pride as different nations' modules join the station and become one international laboratory. Were it not for our Russian partners, we would not have had access to the station following the tragic Columbia accident. And if the U.S. does phase out its shuttle, as the current administration plans to do, then future access to space, at least in the near term, will depend on one nation, Russia, and that's a heavy responsibility for any one nation to bear. More generally, the international cooperation has always been a vital component of our scientific research efforts, not just to share the cost of expensive equipment and facilities, but to get fresh ideas and different perspectives and therefore optimize the chance of discovery. Science has also been an important diplomatic tool. Even during the darkest days of the Cold War, scientific dialogue continued between the U.S. scientists and their counterparts in the USSR. I first visited the Soviet Union in 1967. But while the benefits of cooperation across national boundaries may be clear to us, everyone doesn't share that view, or at least people have concerns. When the current administration announced the U.S. plan to return to the moon and began planning the trip to Mars, there was no apparent effort to consult with our international partners in space and include them in the planning of this ambitious effort. Indeed, it was announced as an America Go-It-Alone program. There was no ambiguity about that statement, and it was suggested that perhaps along the way, at a later stage, other nations might be invited. So this is no misimpression of what was said. That's exactly what was said. Also, with all space technologies and even some activities considered munitions and therefore subject to our State Department export control, international cooperation with any other nation has gotten much more difficult, not just in space, but in many areas, not just in space exploration, but of course in space science as well. And as China and India and other parts of the developing world emerge as major economic powers and competitors in the marketplace, there's a tendency by some to question international cooperation, even in science and technology, and there are legitimate concerns there. The American public and their elected officials in Washington will soon elect a new president, need to understand the arguments for international cooperation, trade-offs to the extent that they need to be made, what those are, and why international cooperation is so important to our nation's future. Indeed, I believe it's in our own self-interest of this nation to collaborate with others in space. I think the U.S. is coming out of something of a dark period. There is light, I believe, maybe even enlightenment at the end of the tunnel. I'm optimistic at this point, and having a chance to interact with you and hear the discussions makes me even more optimistic. But we have experts on these subjects, and it's more important now that we hear what they have to say about them. So what I'd like to do is very briefly introduce each of them, roughly in the order that they're seated, but I probably don't have this exactly right. And then I'll just ask, starting with Leroy, to proceed down the table with comments, and then we'll take your questions. I'll be very brief because many of you know these individuals, and so long introductions are not necessary. Dr. Leroy Chow is a former astronaut, currently chairman of the user panel, I believe, of the National Space Biological Research Institute, NSBRI. General Joe Ingalls, former astronaut, who is very much involved in a fascinating initiative with the joint U.S.-Russian Commission on human space flight. And health issues with Dr. Volker Daman, are you here? Yes, Volker is head of the crew medical support for the European Space Agency. Dr. Rose Gottemüller is a former Deputy Undersecretary for Defense and Non-Proliferation in the U.S. Department of Energy and is currently Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. Dr. Chiaki Mukai is a former astronaut with the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency and currently is head of biomedical research at the agency. Dr. Dave Williams is a former astronaut with the Canadian Space Agency and is currently surgical professor at McMaster University. And so, of course, each of you can correct my introductions as we move down the road, but let's start with Leroy.
Okay. Thank you very much, Neil. It's a pleasure. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you again today. As far as this panel goes, I guess I can, I grew up during the Cold War, so perhaps it's understandable looking back why, as a young person, I really didn't think much of international cooperation. I was growing up also during the space race, and we won the space race after all, didn't we? And so even those views prevailed even when I joined NASA in 1990. In fact, Don Thomas, who's my classmate in 1990 at NASA, he and I started together. But even then, it was much more efficient. Walt Cunningham brought up some very good points. I agree with them. International cooperation means that your program's going to take longer, and it also means it's going to cost more. And there's a lot more politics involved, not just in your own nation or your own organization. Now you've got international politics involved. So for all those reasons, it complicates things. So it can perhaps be understandable, again, why in those early days, I really didn't think much of international cooperation. Well, shortly after we started, or I started training to be an astronaut, the Soviet Union started falling apart. And pretty soon we started hearing rumors that we were going to start doing things with the Russian space program. That was at the same time interesting and kind of disconcerting. And like most astronauts in that time period, we weren't that enthusiastic about it. We were kind of interested to find out what was going on in Russia, but we weren't that interested in necessarily getting involved in it. Just a year or so later, I was assigned to my first space mission with Don Thomas and with Chiaki Mukai. We ended up flying together on Space Shuttle Columbia. Our mission was the second International Microgravity Lab. And during the training for that mission, we traveled all over the place. We were in Japan, we were in Europe, back in the U.S., and we also trained with a French astronaut, Jean-Jacques Favier, who was with CNES at the time. So we got a real good view, working with the scientists and the astronauts and specialists from these countries on different viewpoints and different attitudes, not only about the space program, but also about our different countries and our different philosophies and points of view. And it was all very exciting and illuminating. But it really wasn't until my experience with going over and training long-term with the Russians for my space station mission that I really personally got turned around and really convinced that this was a good thing. Dr. Lane brought up the obvious benefits of international cooperation. That is, after the Columbia accident, we were able to rely on the Russian assets to continue to resupply the space station, and vice versa. The Russians have greatly enjoyed the benefits of having a space shuttle available to take cargo, vast amounts of cargo up and down from the station, to ferry some of their cosmonauts up and back from the station. So I think everybody in the room agrees that there are some obvious benefits to international cooperation. But for me, the personal revolution kind of came along with having to spend a lot of time over there. Don also spent a lot of time in Russia. He was training for a flight, and before that he was director of operations for NASA over there. And so he can identify with this when I say that we kind of had split lives. All the crews and all the specialists who did this had split lives. We had our American life and we had our Russian life. I had to learn Russian to a proficient enough level that I served as a co-pilot of the Soyuz vehicle. And so when I lived in Russia, I got to the point where I became, or I felt like a Russian. And I was able to see their points of view, admire their technology, and even understand their jokes, and that's when you really understand a culture, because jokes don't translate either way. I started to take a bigger view just personally. This is a global society we live in now. I was talking to Marlene yesterday, and she's very much a believer in this. Everybody's got Blackberries or iPhones if you've escaped NASA. Sorry about that. They are cooler. But not that long ago, I was in China for some meetings, and I was sitting in the locked myself in the restroom because my family was sleeping at 3 a.m. Participating in a telecon in a board meeting. You had a board of directors meeting of this small company, and we tied in someone from Germany, and everybody else was in Scottsdale, Arizona. And that kind of gives you an idea of what kind of world we live in now. You're connected, and if you don't accept this and participate in it, you're going to get left behind. In September of 2006, I was invited by the Chinese to visit their equivalent of the Johnson Space Center in Beijing. Very interesting visit, and I'll talk a little bit more about that today at lunch. But I got to meet some of their national astronauts and see what they were doing. They're very serious about their space program, and I'm very excited about the possibilities of U.S. collaboration with China as well. So. I'll kind of stop now and turn the mantle over to Joe Engel, but I just want to say again that from the big picture point of view, I think the benefits of international cooperation outweigh the disadvantages.
I think your iPhone's going off.
Yep. And you also have to be cognizant enough to put it on vibrate.
They become a very, very short leash. Well, first of all, let me thank you all for inviting me to be on this panel. I feel inadequate, at the very least, being up here with all the talent that's here. And I did not come with a prepared speech like Leroy, although Leroy is very good at talking right off the hat. There's bad news and good news about that. The bad news is that I'm at that age where I have a very short memory, so not having notes is going to be a disadvantage. The good news is that I just returned from Russia, having a joint commission meeting this last week. In fact, I got in Saturday, so it hasn't been that long, and I may be able to fake my way through this panel. Leroy covered and the aspects, the advantages and the benefits of international cooperation have really been discussed very, very well. Really, the main points that I had hoped to bring out have really been brought out and discussed in a great more detail than would be able to do. Leroy covered a whole bunch of them. I think some of them that I've had the pleasure of doing, and that is when Leroy talked about getting to know and getting immersed with an international partner, and in particular with the Russians. I remember I was very much involved during the Cold War time too. I was a fighter pilot like Walt during the Cold War, and flew alert missions in an F-100, and had some very exciting missions and assignments. When Mr. Abbey asked me to participate and be on the Joint Commission and work with the Russians, I was quite honestly hesitant, to say the least, because I trained my whole professional career in an adversarial mode with the Russians, and trained to fight the Russians. And I told George that I really wasn't sure that I was the right person to be on this panel of working with the Russians, because I didn't know whether it would work out or not. And Mr. Abbey said, well, quite frankly, Joe Henry, I'm not looking for anything substantive from you. You're just my litmus paper. If you can get along with him, I think anybody can get along with him. And I found very quickly that was really sage observation on George's part, because we found that in working with international partners, and I can only speak with working with the Russians, but certainly with the Russians, we found that our cultures are not all that different. We speak about the differences in culture. They're not that different. The values, the core values that we both have are the same. And it boils down to deciding whether you want to make something work or not, aside from the political and the monetary things. But to get something accomplished, you just have to walk in and decide, I'm going to like this and I'm going to make it work. And before you know it, if you are sincere with those you're working with, you develop a very deep sense of trust and respect, both professional and personal respect, with each other, and before you know it, you're both wanting and trying to find common ground that will result in a solution. We have both been going into space for nearly 40 years now, and we have done some things very differently. And when we try to combine the way that we do things to commonize the things that we do so that we can be efficient in working together on an international space station, each side feels, well, we've been doing it and doing it right and doing it successfully for 40 years. I don't need to change. You need to do it my way. And it's very refreshing to me to come across repeatedly the things where we see that maybe the other guy does do it better. Maybe he does do it more efficiently, or the end result is more complete. And when there is a common ground and we both compromise and give in, it's very, very refreshing to see both sides walk away saying, yeah, that is a better way than what I've been doing it. I feel blessed to have been part of the panel, George, and I thank you. I've been working it for about 13 years now, and it didn't take me 13 years to realize that, but I do realize that very, very much now. So I think with that, I would like to quit talking and pass the buck on down the hall.
Do you want to go in the order you introduced us?
I think we can just go straight down, Rose. That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Joe.
Right. Well, I was struck by our two sets of previous comments. My name's Rose Gadamuller, and I'm directing the Carnegie Moscow Center now. So I've been living in Moscow the last 3 years, although I haven't had a whole lot of interaction with the space community in my time there. I did become involved working with Neil Lane and with George Abbey during the Clinton administration in the early stages of developing the ISS cooperative program, and so I'm very, very proud of that. But in recent years, I've been working much more with the U.S. and Russian Academy of Sciences on what can be a stable basis for high technology cooperation between our two countries, so the broader set of issues. And second, I've been, thanks to my own professional background, working a lot on what shall we do about further, deeper, more intensive cooperation in an entirely different area, that is nuclear energy, continuing also to build out our very successful non-proliferation cooperation with the Russians. So I wanted to bring those two aspects to our discussion today. There's nothing I can tell you about the space cooperation. It is hands down, I think, the clearest example of how the United States and Russia have been able to develop a true partnership over the past almost 15 years at this point. And I regret greatly, as a policy person working on U.S.-Russian relations, that there are no other good examples, at least as far as I can tell, and perhaps someone can bring me up to date on some other good examples. But as far as the space programs are concerned, they have been essentially intertwined and are working together rather well, with the problems of efficiency that were brought up at the end of our previous session. But I do believe that nevertheless we're gaining, as our previous two speakers have remarked. Let me first begin by just mentioning the conclusions of a U.S. National Academy of Sciences and Russian Academy of Sciences joint study that I chaired about a year and a half ago, where we came to the conclusion that cooperative efforts are at a turning point with regard to the non-proliferation programs. No longer should or can the Russian Federation be solely the recipient of non-proliferation assistance. It is now politically and economically, as well as militarily, ready to take its place as a true partner of the United States in the effort to contain the proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. But we noted also in that study that there would have to be some heavy lifting done in both capitals in order to change the way that we thought about each other and thought about working with each other. And again, I think there are probably some good answers coming out of the space cooperation over the past 15 years. But there were 3 points, 3 question areas. First of all, is Russia really ready to take more of a leadership role on the non-proliferation programs by putting its own financial resources on the table, by taking more responsibility for setting priorities and managing projects? This question, I think, has become quite urgent in the U.S. Congress in the last year or two, as our congressmen and senators see Russia's economic health picking up, see a real change from the situation of the 1990s when Russia was in the midst of an economic crisis. So that question has come up very much. Again, I think this is an area where you have answered the question in the space program, and we need to somehow get that answer out there. But second is a tough question for the United States. That is the United States comfortable with letting Russia take more of a management role, take more responsibility for setting priorities? Or will the United States, as it has traditionally in the non-proliferation programs, want to be the one leading the way, setting the priorities, insisting on its own management style and its own management approaches? Again, I think you have answered those questions to a large degree in the space cooperation. And the third point is one where you probably haven't found the complete answer, given some of the comments earlier this morning about the programs, when they're an international program, slowing things down rather than speeding it up. That is, what implications does fuller U.S.-Russian partnership have for speeding up vital work that should be done by Russia and the United States? Can the two countries work together and more effectively produce results in their joint cooperation? So I think, those are 3 tough questions. I think you've got some good answers already flowing out of the space cooperation, but they're not yet complete answers. Now, I wanted to bring up, as I draw these remarks to a close, the area that has been painfully emerging on nuclear energy cooperation, and you've already been through it with the Iran Non-Proliferation Act of 2000, where again, in the space program, you had to find answers to a very tough set of questions coming forth out of our Congress and coming forth out of Washington on what kind of cooperation can ensue between the United States and Russia. Where the nuclear energy cooperation is concerned, there is a complete new set of constraints emerging, starting with the Iran Freedom Support Act of 2006 And more recently, just recently, H.R. 1400, the Iran Counterproliferation Act of 2007, and a Senate variant which has 70 Senate co-sponsors. These bills are having the effect of placing constraints even now on the possibility of U.S.-Russian nuclear energy cooperation. But furthermore, you may be aware that the U.S. Executive branch, the Bush administration, last week sent up to Congress an agreement for peaceful nuclear cooperation, a so-called 123 agreement under the Atomic Energy Act of 1953. This would enable wide-ranging cooperation, although it's not the only thing that would be needed for contracts to be signed between U.S. and Russian entities to do nuclear energy cooperation. So I think it's very clear that Congress is going to have its say where these types of high technology, high risk cooperation are concerned, even when very clearly such cooperation is in the U.S. national interest. So in closing, I'd just like to offer three thoughts about policy areas that I think we really need to continue to focus our attention on very squarely. And again, I think in many ways you've led the way with the space program. First, we have to make the case very clearly to our friends on Capitol Hill and elsewhere in the kind of opinion leader community. We have to make the case for the ways in which technology cooperation serves the national interests of the United States, makes it possible for us to enhance our security, our economic situation, science and technology accomplishment, innovation, in ways that we could not otherwise do. And I think looking at nuclear energy, and I'm spending a lot of time, I just spent 2 days in St. Petersburg last week looking at proliferation resistance and the ways in which Russian technological approaches can actually serve our non-proliferation goals where nuclear energy technology is concerned. So we have to make those points more clearly, I think, but they're difficult and sometimes highly inaccessible to the public, inaccessible to an opinion-making audience. Second, I think we have to shine light on the successes we have achieved in the past. And here, the space program, again, I think is a very fine example where we need to draw more examples out into the public arena of how you have succeeded and also what difficult solutions you've had to work your way through. But we also have examples of success on the commercial side, I think, that further bolsters this sense of national interest. I don't know the degree to which you've been talking about projects like the Sea Launch project over the last couple of days, but the Boeing Engineering and Design Center in Moscow, I think, is another good example of that. And finally, this point is a controversial one, but I want to lay it before you, and I would be interested in any comments that you have from where you sit. I think we need to be attentive now to the advent of a new Russian leadership and how it might improve the environment for cooperation. Everyone, when you read the Western press, has been assuming that Putin and Medvedev will keep up their tough guy act. They will stress the image of the enemy, as they have been doing in the last year and a half. They will threaten many things, even the onset of a new Cold War. However, I think that there is one option that is well worth watching, and that is that perhaps Putin has now accomplished what he needed to accomplish with his Munich speech of a year and a half ago, with his tough guy act. Perhaps now, under a new president, President Medvedev, the Kremlin will be ready to assume a more pragmatic approach, not dropping the tough image. It serves the Russians' interests as they perceive them, but putting more emphasis on problem solving in the international community. And that, in turn, may create a more welcoming political environment here in Washington on Capitol Hill for cooperation with the Russians. But I think that's a big if. There is, I think, a lot of unhappiness with the tough guy image that the Kremlin has been projecting over the last couple years. Again, at the high level, at the political level, it creates difficulties for nurturing new cooperation. Where cooperation is already going forward and is underneath the political radar scope, you can get things done. But up above, at a higher level, for starting new cooperation, like nuclear energy cooperations, the barriers are very high on the political scene. So I think nevertheless, we should be willing to give the new leadership team in Moscow the benefit of the doubt. And I welcome your comments and questions and look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
I'd like to talk to you about the power of dreams. Way back when I was growing up in Canada, at age 7, I watched the first Mercury Gemini astronauts flying in space, and I dreamt of becoming an astronaut. In those days, I used the word impossible. People told me, my teachers told me it was impossible for you to become an astronaut because Canada did not have humans flying in space. And I, in those days, believed the use of the word impossible. Nowadays, I no longer believe in the use of the word impossible. I've had a chance to fly in space, and as I mentioned to you yesterday, standing on the end of the Canadian-built robotic arm, looking at the Earth beneath me. The Earth, the cradle of humanity. And as Konstantin Tsiolkovsky said, it is time for humans to leave the cradle. When we stand in space as astronauts and cosmonauts and taikonauts working together to explore this unique environment, one of the things that's truly the most remarkable is that there is this spacefaring culture that begins to emerge, that you're no longer just a Canadian or an American or a Japanese astronaut, European astronaut, Russian cosmonaut. All of a sudden, you're a member of this unique group of spacefaring humans that's going forward and exploring space. And you know, we can joke about it. We all have our different national backgrounds. We all have our different unique aspects to our culture. I remember being on the International Space Station, and Fyodor looks at me, the space station commander. Fyodor says to me, "Dave, we in the space station program fully understand that the station is just the base for the Canadian arm." And I thought, well, isn't this great, you know, that we can all recognize the areas of expertise that we bring to the table. And as a Canadian, having a chance to have ridden the robotic arm, I was very, very proud of the contribution that the Canadian Space Agency has made in developing space robotics, contributing to the ability to return the shuttle to flight after the tragic loss of Columbia, bringing the capability of the OBSS system to inspect the tiles on the bottom of the space shuttle, bringing the NEPTEC camera that enables us to inspect the tiles. We're one of the major players involved in exploring space. You know, we talk about international involvement, and I had the very significant privilege of working internationally on a day-to-day basis. When Mr. Abbey was Center Director, he called me up in June of 1998. I just got back from my first space flight, and I have this message saying, "Phone Mr. Abbey." And as every astronaut knows, when you get a message saying, "Phone Mr. Abbey," you start to get worried really quickly. So I wasn't quite sure what this was all about, and George gets on the phone and says, "Davis, I'd like you to come and work with us in NASA and be the director of the Space and Life Sciences Directorate." And my immediate reaction was, "George, I'm a Canadian. I mean, how are you going to work this all out?" Well, George did work it out, and I had the remarkable privilege of being a foreign national working as a senior manager in the U.S. government for 4.5 years. And to me, that's a true testimony of the fact that we've embraced international participation. There are members of the Space and Life Sciences Directorate in this group today, and I feel that we're one very big family. I feel very, very close to that organization, even now after having retired and left the program. And that's the kind of capability that comes from working as an international. The two first co-founding chairs of the Multinational Medical Policy Board, Anatoly Grigoriev, representing the Russian space program, and myself, a Canadian representing NASA. To me, that speaks for the internationalization that's part of this program. As we look forward to the future, the major spacefaring nations of the world will leave low Earth orbit. I would like us to sit back and consider that I was once a kid in a foreign country watching people like Joe Engle, Walt Cunningham, flying in space. They were my heroes. I dreamt of doing something that seemed to be impossible because my country wasn't involved in it. As leaders in exploring space on the behalf of humanity, shouldn't we be embracing international partnership? Shouldn't we be finding new partners to enable that next group of spacefaring astronauts, cosmonauts, taikonauts, those people who want to become astronauts, give them a chance to be able to participate? As we look forward to sending humans back to the moon and on to Mars, I liken it to a path of footsteps. you can imagine all the hard work that each of you in this room has done, contributing on that path of footsteps, leaving those footsteps that will take us back to the moon and ultimately on to Mars. When you look at those footsteps, whether they are laid by a Russian cosmonaut, a US astronaut, a Chinese taikonaut, a Japanese astronaut, or whoever it may be, the footsteps look the same. We represent the exploration of space truly on the behalf of humanity. For me, it's just been a real honor and a pleasure to have played a very, very small part in that exploration, and I look forward to the continued exploration of space and having that an international exploration of space. In closing, I get often asked, now that you've flown in space twice and you've lived underwater in 2 missions, what dreams do you have? My dreams right now are not for me. My dreams are for the 7-year-olds out there right now, somewhere in the world, that are going to be those astronauts, cosmonauts, whoever, walking on the surface of Mars. Our job is to enable that dream to become a reality. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Okay.
Let's take that over here. Yeah, thank you also for inviting me back again. It's the second time I'm here. I'm very proud to be in that elite team here. It's always a challenge and also very interesting to speak here and to be in the panels and in the audience. I would like to come back to what we heard 30 minutes ago coming from Walt Cunningham. Yes, indeed, it is tough to work as international partners. Things take longer, are more complex, are more challenging, are more expensive. But I want to react in quoting your former president. We're doing it not because it's easy, but we are doing it because it's hard. And I think that is also what should drive us, next generation, not going to the moon, but going back to the moon, going to Mars, running ISS. That should drive us in our spirit. It's not hard, but the challenges are ahead of us, and we have to remove them, and we have to solve those issues. It's for the first time in mankind that 5 big nations or 5 big agencies are constructing a space station and doing something that mankind has never done before. I think we should not close our eyes before that. We have traveled the seas as individual nations and nationalities. We have gone, explored the space in the beginning as individual nations and nationalities. But I think now is also a new time that is opening up. We are now doing something in 5 big nationalities, 5 big nations around the globe. And we're also seeing in other areas, not the space activities, but all over the globe, we have global challenges. We have wars, we have economic situations, we have ecologic situations. And if we are not, as a small team, don't get our act together and resolve the issues that we currently face on ISS, how should mankind solve the even bigger problems around that globe in a cooperative manner? So that is why I think there is no way out of exploring and continuing moving forward, moving mankind forward. If we have to do it in a collaborative effort. And as David said, I think we are all humans. We share dreams, we share goals, and even if we talk about different nationalities, I think we are not so far apart. We are a species, we are humans, and I think it's among all the scientific knowledge that is compiled throughout the space missions, I think there's also still the human dream to explore, to look beyond the horizon. And I think that's something that all of us share, and that is the main driver. Yes, indeed, there are national boundaries, there are cultural boundaries that may inhibit us exploring and moving forward. But I think those should be the smallest problem, and we should somehow bypass those problems. James Abbey was in our group yesterday, and he reminded us, also looking back in history and what has been done in the past, and maybe sometimes not looking into history and then doing a fresh start. But if I look back, I was born in '59, so the race, the competition between Russia or the Soviet Union and the United States at that time was a no-brainer for me. Well, there was not that much brain at that time as a 6-year-old, but also maybe because of the heritage. I'm German, and growing up in the 60s, you didn't dare to say that you are German. The nationalistic element in Germany still is not very highly developed because of the post-war time. So for me, when I saw, I got books, I know the first 7 astronauts, I still remember a book I have somewhere on my bookshelf with Walt Cunningham. I didn't realize those were Americans or Russian astronauts, Gagarin. Those were humans. And still remember the night in July in '69 when the first human stepped on the moon. I think that for me, it was a human. It was not an American. And I'm looking forward to the time when another human is setting foot on Martian soil. And that is driving me in my work to promote international cooperation to the highest extent, and trying to forget national boundaries and solving the issues ahead of us, and going back into space as a human entity without cultural and national limitations. Thank you.
So I'm Chiaki Mukai from Japanese Space Agency. So the next 5 minutes, I would like to talk 2 things. The first one is one of the example of the benefits of the international cooperation. And the second thing is a kind of suggested area of international cooperation. So the first one, talking about the benefit of the international collaboration. As an example, like for example, this year is such an exciting year for Japanese people because 3 Japanese astronauts is going, actually 1 has already flown, so 2 more to fly. And the Japanese experimental module is going up. The biggest module is going up soon. And the first Japanese for long-term space stay will start at the end of this year. So, and also this June, the full-scale utilization of the Japanese module will be started, which means we will be given the allocation of the utilization based on the dedication to the International Space Station, which is 12.8%. That is the biggest contribution amongst the other, except the Russian, but compared to ESA and CSA currently. But if I think about how many Japanese astronauts that the space life science medicine can have as the subject, we have only 6 or 7 slots for the Japanese astronauts based on the 12.8% allocation given. And let's say the ESA, I think your case is 8.3%. And then maybe 4 to 5 slots. And then CSA, 2.8%. And then it's 2 to 3%. So if 2 to 3 people, the Canadian people, fly until the end of the ISS program, which is 2016, right? So if we only target on the Japanese astronaut for doing some life science experiments, we have only 6 or 7 in numbers. So we really need to work together to maximize the precious resources to promote the science field for understanding what happening on the human beings being exposed to the Martian environment, to understand the situation for developing for the future steps, which is exploration on the moon or Mars. So the first thing, of course, everybody agrees, the international collaboration needs to be done to maximize the precious resource from this viewpoint. So that is the first point I would like to make. And the second point is the suggested area of international cooperation. I believe there are many areas that we can do the international cooperation, but well, to me, the one of the low risk and high return area is the education. Because usually we don't need to put a lot of budget to the educational program compared to the, for let's say, developing some special hardware to support some special experiments, etc., which we may not know what kind of outcome will come. But since the budget-wise and also the programmatic-wise, educational program is one of the area that we can work together because everybody says education is important. Nobody offend that one country exceed the educational program to the others, right? So one of the example that we did was during the STS-65, which I had the privilege to fly with Leroy and Don Thomas. We had a small experiment, an experiment using the small fish called medaka. And this is exactly the same kind of experiment. Well, it's a fish experiment, but this is like the experiment that the Russian the doctor mentioned about the plant experiment. It's like a hands-on type of experiment to let students think about the result or to let students observe the behavior of the small animal, so that the students were the part of the crew which actually doing the experiment on board. So on the ground, many students and the few astronauts, we were together to do one experiment. So we share the importance and also the wonder of the nature at that time. And interestingly enough, originally this experiment, this program was just happened because of the enthusiasm of the principal investigator of this experiment. So as you mentioned, if some teacher who is so enthusiastic and so energetic to teach something to students, and not only teach or transfer knowledge, but also let them think, let them touch, let them feel, let them do, and let them be a part of us. And then it's encouraged the student, and then originally students were human beings, full of curiosity. So those are the, I think, education that we can do with very small amount of the budget, but of course with the enthusiasm, high energy and high enthusiasm. And then the consequence of this experiment, educational program was great, because the experiment was originally to see how small the small fish can mate in space, or if those fish can lay eggs, to see the fertilization process or the organ development. That is the original experiment. But since the nature of the experiment is like that, after the space flight, the principal investigator gave the offsprings of space-born killfish, medaka, to 240 schools. And then nowadays, it happened in 1994, our flight. It's 14 hours later, the almost 15th generation of the small killfish, the children are still cherish those fish. And then one day I visited the school, and the small children says, "Oh, Chiaki, I want to show you something very interesting. You know that this fish, the offsprings of the space-born medaka." And then those children, they are in maybe the age of 10 years old or something like that. The boy doesn't know that the parent, the ancestor of this offspring medaka flew with me. But even so, the small children is learning about the how living organisms the live in the environment, the nice environment, and also the biological things they learn, and also most important thing is they cherish the life. So I think that is one of the situations because educational program is like planting the seed. We can afford to buy small seed, even if we cannot afford to buy big trees. But if we can buy seeds and then plant them and then make it big, so that's how I think educational program works. And then this is the part that internationally, if we can work together, then we can get to the big, the high return with low risk or low input. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Let me ask panelists if they have comments of one another based on what you've heard, and then we'll open it up very quickly.
No, thank you.
Thank you. So do we have questions then from the audience? Please. Microphone is somewhere.
To take part in presentation, in analysis, in discussion of problems connected with main goal to develop the reliable and effective method life support during the future international importance missions to Moon and missions to Mars. Secondly, results of our discussion during round table, all presentation of participants permit, according to my understanding, to us come to conclusion that really this activity directed of solution of problems connected with life support is an international problem, and only in the range of international collaboration we can obtain the results permit to reliable and effective support the life for future traveling on Mars, on the Moon. And my recommendation, my opinion, maybe all issue that we can obtain and see permit us include in our issue of our meeting recommendation to increase the international collaboration in solution of all aspects of the problem, developing system for life support future Moon and Mars mission as official opinion of our meeting. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Other questions? Let's go over here and then we'll come back.
Thank you for the great comments. I certainly support international collaboration. I was very fortunate to fly on a product of international collaboration, the Space Lab module, and our mission, Neuralab, was an international collaboration. I've had other scientific activities outside of NASA that have also been collaborative and very productive. But the people who pay the bills, the taxpayers and people who appropriate the money, will often want to know, outside of constructing the International Space Station, what tangible benefits are coming back that we can ascribe to international collaboration? How would you answer that question, which is going to be the one that most of us will face?
Who would like to start?
I'll take a stab at that. You know, I think one of the things that's really exciting about the international aspect of flying in space is that each nation brings its greatest technical capability. So in other words, participating in space is about the future of technology. And as a nation, one can decide whether or not you want to be technology enablers, developers, or technology consumers. So if I look at this from a Canadian perspective, as the Canadian Space Agency identified its niche area in technology development in space, it focused on robotics. So then the return to the taxpayer is based on that investment in technology in the future. And if you look at Canadian space robotics, the application of the principles of space robotics are significant terrestrially. So we now are using the robotic capability developed by McDonald Detweiler to develop advanced mining robots that are autonomous, that can work at depths beneath the surface of the Earth that would be unsafe for humans to be able to do. Robots that are autonomous, that can work with radiation sources where humans would otherwise be exposed to high levels of radiation. Surgical robots that can enable people to perform advanced precision surgical procedures. And I think it really boils down to every nation sitting back to say, as we go forward and we're exploring space, the technologies that we develop in so doing have market applications here on Earth that help maintain our nation as a technology producer and leading the world in terms of our unique economic aspects of that. And I think the challenge is for all of us to sit back and say, where is that return? Where are we getting that return? But from a Canadian perspective, we could not have achieved that return if we had not been able to participate. And enabling that participation is a critical element for all the countries that are part of the spacefaring nations of the world.
Any other? Yes.
Yeah, but maybe the answer sometimes is more subtle. An example, for example, is data sharing and data confidentiality. It took us, and Kathy, you're in the room here. We had the problem that how do we transfer medical data from A to B between US and Russia and Europe and Japan. So we had to evaluate what are the legal requirements on all those different countries. So that is an intellectual, interesting challenge, but it also has effects for the future. So how do we deal with patient data in each national context? So from that we drive, okay, what are the technicalities that we secure data based on the legal requirements? And that has a benefit that may be not that obvious to the people and the taxpayers, but it is driving terrestrial applications down the roads and in areas you don't expect right away.
Other comments, Rose?
I think these two answers really illustrated what I wanted to say about this, and that is that you can answer this question on two levels. First, you can come up with, I think, some very good examples, as Dave did, of how there have been actual benefits that have emerged from the cooperation, and they can be described in detail. But then you get to another level, which Volker's remarks suggest, that is that there's a kind of a larger strategic benefit, and you need to make that case as well. I think you could even draw it out to talk about the benefits of such cooperation in a globalized economic system, where essentially the attention has been perhaps to economic systems of interaction, but where science and technology and innovation is concerned, perhaps we haven't made those cases well enough. So there's I think, a narrow set of examples that are excellent examples we can talk about, but then we can talk about larger strategic benefits as well. For example, what the benefits are for interaction in a globalized world where we've got a very real set of challenges, data exchange, in this case regarding medical data, but in many other areas I think that those same kinds of examples could apply.
Let's take another question right here in the middle, please.
Well, we speak about very positive things, streams, how good international collaboration is, but also maybe I should put a little bit water into this wine, because we have the reality right now, and right now I see a huge problem in the international collaboration between Europe and the United States, a huge problem. And the problem, I think, is that the United States is seen in Europe as unstable, changing horses all the time, with great visions, luring us into activities and then saying, well, we do something else and leave you alone. And for example, for myself, in the last years, I have had huge problems just saying I want to continue to have money for human spaceflight, or I want to. We should have a strategy to participate in flights to Moon and Mars. I was even threatened, if you say Moon and Mars, we will reduce your budget, because what's going on is not reliable. So we have a huge problem currently, and Germany is the country in Europe which puts most money into human spaceflight. So in Germany now, and France is shaky now also about its participation in human spaceflight. And in Germany, presently, we have two fractions in government. One fraction says we should stop participation in human spaceflight because we cannot make a profit out of visions and dreams. And a former chancellor in Germany said, somebody who has visions and dreams should go and see a doctor. and I have visions and dreams, but it's difficult to bring this over even to decision makers. And the other fraction right now says we have to get independent. We have to get our own human access to space because the Americans are not really reliable. So I think United States has to do something to convince the decision makers that United States are reliable and that we will also profit from investments into space.
Who on the panel would like to offer encouragement in this regard? I can make a comment. I mean, it is in part our system. You know, our founding fathers set up a system that functions on one level quite well, I think, but it has its downsides as well. And long-term planning and consistency and continuity is difficult in this system. There are many examples in many areas. I think probably you would agree there are places where the United States has made its commitment and has followed through, but there's uncertainty, and I recognize particularly in this area. I would like to think that if we're successful in raising the profile of space, just to stay with this particular area, the importance of our space science and exploration effort, and then within that, the importance of international cooperation, and get that in the minds of our leaders, our future leaders in the Congress and in the White House, that along with that will come an understanding of a need to stand by our commitments and maybe reduce a little bit the uncertainty. But one thing I've learned in Washington is it's always going to be a surprise. So I appreciate your candor, and many of us recognize that there are these problems. We all need to work together to try to get around them. Other comments? Yeah, so Leroy.
I can understand your comments and agree with them and can see from your viewpoint and from Germany's viewpoint how unreliable America must appear as a partner. It reminded me actually of the early days when we were working with the Russians, and there were a large group of us wondering why we were doing this, and wouldn't it be faster and cheaper to do it alone? And here we are slipping the launch of the delivery and the launch of the FGB, and the delivery and the launch of the Zvezda was very much in question, so much in question that we began investigating alternatives. So I think this is a kind of the same thing. It's an example of the difficulties of international cooperation, and there makes you want to say, well, what is this for? Let's quit. Let's go develop our own capabilities. Let's go it alone. But in the end, I think everyone will agree that the international collaboration on the International Space Station was very much worthwhile. And so it's a matter of getting through these very difficult times and trying to look farther out and hanging in there with the difficult times until you can reap the benefits of the collaboration. But I can certainly sympathize.
Yeah, I just have a quick little perspective on this. So I was selected in 1992. 5,300 people applied. They select 4 people. 7 days after I'm selected, I get the insider scoop. Space station program's been canceled. I'm here as a space station astronaut, and I sit there and I go, well, this is a little concerning. I've just changed my whole life to come and be an astronaut, and the program's been canceled. Well, of course, the rumor wasn't totally true. We were 1 vote away from canceling the program. But what I learned from that is not to overreact to the changing dynamics of the international aspect of the space program. And I think one of the things that's really nice about being an international partner is the flexibility to define national goals and to partner with many different international partners to achieve those national goals. Whether the U.S. program is being a little bit more national in its space program, there's certainly Russia that one can participate with. There are other spacefaring nations of the world coming into being. China and India are very, very excited about becoming involved in this. So there's many different options to be able to pursue, and I think that's one of the great things about being an international. And the last part about all of this is, the comment about dreams, and that's I think it's a very important comment to put on the table, because often when I go out and I talk about doing the impossible, people react that way. And yet we will not develop novel technologies if we sit back and we accept the definition of the word impossible. And I'm going to embarrass myself in public again. I love doing this, but remember when the sound barrier was impossible? Right? And the physicists said, boy, terrible things are going to happen and the things are going to blow up, blah, blah, blah. Can't get through it. Chuck Yeager proved that wrong. Well, now, of course, we talk about the speed of light as an impossible barrier to break. We use the word impossible. We limit ourselves and our capabilities in thinking what we're able to achieve. So I would challenge all of you, get rid of the word, dare to dream, and achieve great goals.
Thank you, Dave. We might have a conversation about the speed of light later.
I've heard a couple people say today that in international programs, I assume the total cost is higher. Yet, I think we've also heard the argument for the public that international cooperation, the cost per country is actually lower because you all share. Is that a legitimate argument, or is it end up finally, for example, International Space Station being higher per country as well, as if, in the sense that if they would have gone alone, they would have paid maybe less?
Anyone run the budgets?
I'll just say my 2 cents worth from the Canadian perspective. We couldn't have gone alone. I mean, we developed robotics to enable people to go forward and explore space. So, if that's what we do, we would still be involved in satellites, telecommunication, remote sensing, and biosatellites and things, but we wouldn't have a human program.
Back to our German colleague here, I would have to say amen to his comments. And I agree with you, Neil, that yes, long-term financing would be a step towards some kind of stability, but that's just the end result. The real problem is the underpinning to that. You're not going to get any kind of long-term multi-administration financing as long as we have moved ourselves in our culture towards a risk-averse society here in the United States. We are kind of the leaders in that. You'd like to be leading in technology, but we are kind of the leaders in a risk-averse society, and a risk-averse society does not want to keep making these kind of commitments. That is a problem that we have in this country. He feels the ramifications of it, and I would suspect that it's in a lot of other countries as well. And of course, the question about the cost of it, there is no question that when you got more efficiencies and working with a tight little group, you're going to have lower total cost. You have to trade off the added cost by the benefits that come out of it, some of which have been mentioned up here today. But the biggest problem that we have in our space program is having migrated towards a risk-averse culture that we didn't have in the 60s and 70s when everybody was thrilled and stimulated by what was being done.
Comment. The panel have a reaction or other questions?
This is just a comment that flashed across my mind. I'm hoping at least 3 or 4 of the Americans on the panel and those of us sitting in the audience share some of these perspectives, either with a cash donation, as my friend Jay Bucky suggested last night at the table, sent to your candidate of choice for our presidential race this year, but certainly after January, suggesting all the benefits we've just outlined here of supporting human exploration of space and this joint effort. If indeed we have leaders that want to talk and deal directly with leaders of other nations, it sure sounds like this is a good paradigm to promote rather than to defund.
Thank you. Well, it is on our minds. Anybody like to cast their vote now?
Make a donation.
Yeah. I could say that I, without saying anything about what I'm going to, who I support or whatever, my sense is that all the candidates get much about what we're discussing here today. Some of them perhaps will have focused more on that than others, and some have more experience than others. But just what I know about them is part of the reason for my optimism. I have my own views about who I think should lead our country, but I do expect a somewhat more enlightened period, perhaps, than we've had in some of our nation's history. Maybe more reliability and predictability as well. I don't know if we're willing to take risks, Walt. I do agree with you. I see it in science. I see it in sort of the culture and our young people and so forth. So that's an issue as a nation that we're really going to have to face. One more question.
Neil,
then we really
could I
have
just
to
follow
move
on?
Sorry. Oh,
Could I
yes.
just
Rose has comment.
You know,
Thank
again, I'd just like to bring up the area I've been working on so much, which is nuclear energy cooperation. And here the same blasted thing is happening in that we've had a global nuclear energy partnership launched, and it's stalling out rather quickly, stalling out on Capitol Hill in terms of budget and so forth. I think, to be honest, that what is happening with regard to nuclear energy is that there will be a political sea change continuing in this country. It's already underway toward more attention to nuclear power. And as a result of that, even though the global nuclear energy partnership may not survive this administration in its current form, nevertheless, there will be a new interest to looking at international cooperation in this particular area. And so I think that bespeaks a kind of new burst of interest and overall enthusiasm among between both of our political parties with regard to science, technology, and innovation. And so I very much just wanted to support what you had to say, Neil. I can see it coming in this other area as well, despite the fact that GNEP will not survive the current administration in its current form, in my view.
Any other comments on the panel? We have one last question. Please.
More of a comment to Dr. Mackay. Thank you so much for your comments on education. There's probably no more cost-effective ways to increase visibility, promote collaboration. Internationally, one cannot be against mealworms, C. elegans, yeast, and other types of things that can be done on the space station, yet will fit into everyone's curriculum worldwide. So thank you.
I'd like to thank my panel very much, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I could not be here earlier this morning. Unfortunately, I had to give a report to the Vehicle Integration Office for Orion on our status this morning at 8:30. So thank you very much for waiting. I'm just going to present the results of the focus group discussion that occurred yesterday on lessons learned from biomedical engineering space missions. This session was actually led by Inessa Kozlowska. I unfortunately had to depart early this morning, and Dave Wolf, and I was their surrogate scribe, and I'm going to give you the results of the meeting. Others that attended this session included Jeannie Bopp, Jay Buckey, John Clark, Walt Cunningham, Ken Fong, Ms. Harridge, Dave Hilmers, Richard Jennings, Jim Locke, Vladimir Matveyev, Rick Shearing, Mary Van Balen, Maribon Whitmore, and Eugenia Yarmanova. The topics that were reviewed in this meeting, you can see here, include consumables and supplies that are design drivers for the medical mission, medical capabilities definition, defining the limits of medical capability and when to draw the line, and what diagnoses should we exclude from capability. The countermeasures hardware that's important for these exploration missions, and defining what level of investment should be utilized for these types of hardware items in terms of power, mass, and crew time versus the benefits that they provide. Suited versus unsuited entry, water versus land landing, biomedical monitoring for surface EVAs, reentry orthostatic protection in terms of anti-G suits, anthropometric range for space vehicles, whether or not to use genetic testing or screening for selection of astronauts, the standards associated with allowing individuals to become astronauts, and whether or not things like sprint versus endurance athletes should be relegated prior to flight. Solar particle event monitoring and the medical response in case a solar particle event would happen, long-term health risk and rehabilitation, recovery from long-term flight. What is acceptable from a loss of crew standpoint when it comes to a mission, and how should we trade off mission success criteria versus crew safety criteria? Landing injury risk in nominal and off-nominal landings, acute radiation exposure therapy in terms of what possibly is available in case someone would have a clinical sequelae from a radiation event, and then crew medical officer credentials. So we briefly reviewed all those topics and decided we would give you a more detailed report on, let's see here, I could scroll, on just a few of those. Here we go. Okay, so the first topic that we're going to discuss in detail is the selection standards. And when it comes to genetic testing and screening for selection of astronauts, we commented that this is being done to some degree already. We're already getting clinical histories from our patients. We're asking about their family history. We're identifying those that had clinical phenotypic expression of genetic diseases, and those individuals are being screened out to some degree already in our astronaut selection process. However, there is still a whole host of genetic tests that could be utilized that would identify individuals at risk for genetic diseases that don't have the level of maturity that our focus group felt were ready to go in prime time. They're not ready to be applied to astronauts for selection as an occupational screening technique. And so when it comes to genetic testing, our focus group was going to make a recommendation to this larger group that when genetic testing is conducted, the applicant's future insurability must be preserved. So no matter what genetic testing is done, we have to make sure that it's not used against the individual applicant in terms of potential deniability of either medical or life insurance. That's first and foremost. And then at the time genetic testing is done, at least in the current state of genetic testing, only those tests that can show high probability that the test can predict the likelihood of developing a condition which is disqualifying should be employed. Otherwise, genetic testing can be used for risk evaluation and for managing risk via either countermeasure application or prophylactic medical or surgical procedures, or for informed consent briefings to the crew member, but then should not be applied in terms of a selection standard. So that was the feelings of the group. All right, the next area was anthropometrics. There are many programs, whether they be federal or non-federal, that apply anthropometric standards to the design of vehicles. And as an example, the Russian program has a relatively tight anthropometric range for their vehicles and for their spacesuits. And their anthropometric range is 130 to 195 centimeters standing height and 99 centimeters sitting height are their maximums, and 95 kilogram is their maximum weight. The NASA Standard 3000 currently allows for 5th percentile Japanese females to 95th percentile American males in the anthropometric range. However, there is a number of components of the current International Space Station requirements that employ this particular range that are not met because the Soyuz vehicle, as an example, and the Russian spacesuits, and even the U.S. spacesuits do not accommodate this entire range. And so we're not meeting the current requirement. And so for constellation, the question is, what is the right anthropometric range to employ? Right now, in the constellation documents, the anthropometric range that is being sought is 1 percentile American female to 99th percentile American male. That's the range that's trying to be accommodated in these vehicles, and perhaps that is not necessarily a smart way to go about trying to implement a program. And what the focus group recommendations were is that there are advantages to having limitations in anthropometric ranges, including the use of limitations to ensure mission success and control programmatic cost. And these have been employed in the past. Constellations should try to achieve the broadest anthropometric ranges possible through iterative design cycle analysis without compromising practical design considerations like safety, mass, cost, and schedule, and while maintaining a high probability of mission success. So that was the recommendations regarding anthropometrics. It's a very politically charged topic, let's say, and I know it's a difficult one for our group as well as others to address. Next topic was landing survivability. Landing survivability, one of the issues in landing survivability is suited versus unsuited landing. This has gained a great deal of attention as we had a very good panel session with our Skylab astronauts in the not too distant past, and the recommendations from our Skylab crew members was it's probably best to land the vehicle while not suited. They thought it was a better safety posture to land not suited. However, the current astronaut office has a strong advocacy position for landing in a suited configuration. And so we discussed the merits of suited versus unsuited reentry, and certainly suits provide the opportunity to protect against a number of system failures, including hypoxia, toxic exposure, unplanned pressure reductions and decompression events, etc. However, wearing suits can also produce disadvantages from either intravehicular operations or the landing situation, reentry situation. And as some examples of those include the time that is required to don and doff the suits, reduced tactile feedback and sensitivity during vehicular operations while you're suited, reduced field of view and resolution of view through a helmet, as an example, while suited. Thermal stress after that you land, being in a suit can produce a significant thermal stress if you land in a hot environment. Impaired movement for egress and potentially for water survival. And then it also poses an impediment to provision of medical care in an ill or injured crew member. So for all of these reasons, the focus team felt that the Constellation program should consider including a design that would allow the return of crew members in a non-suited posture, and that the Constellation program should retain that option after they evaluate the likelihood of the hazards that being suited would mitigate, as well as the likelihood that the suited crew member could successfully mitigate those hazards if they were suited and they encountered one of those driving events. So our focus group really wanted to see an evaluation of all those hazards, their likelihood, and then whether or not the suit could successfully mitigate those before they committed the program to force the crew to land in suits. So that was another very tough and difficult question to address. The next issue that the focus team addressed was water versus land landing issues. We didn't have a formal recommendation here. We just have some summary of some points. Water landing is considered off-nominal in the Russian program as opposed to nominal in our current design structure for Constellation. And the philosophy in the Russian program is to design adequate safety in the vehicle landing system to allow land landing to be a nominal event. And acceptable crew injury is felt to be inherent in that safety system, such that it was felt that the likelihood of crew injury is a small enough event that land landing should be allowed to be nominal every mission. Now, nominal water landing could be a significant driver for a non-landing hazard. For instance, if you land in the water There is the potential that the vehicle could lose buoyancy. It could affect the ability to rapidly egress from this vehicle, especially if the sea states are high. There's the potential that you could end up in a situation with high temperatures, but that you can't effectively egress because of the high temperatures. There's also this expense associated with operating a vehicle in the water and requiring the rescue forces to have a buoyancy control system, having divers, having ships to lift the vehicle off the water, etc. And for all of those reasons, the Russian contributors to our focus group felt that land landing overall is a safer approach, and that Constellation should consider that for their nominal landing of their vehicles. Okay, next issue that we tackled was the loss of crew landing injury acceptability. Currently, total mission loss of crew for the shuttle program, the risk is approximately 1 in 80, and those numbers have been bouncing around, but somewhere between 1 in 75 and 1 in 100 is the current loss of crew risk associated with those missions. In the CARD, the current Constellation Architecture Requirements document, the loss of crew acceptable risk is 1 in 200, and that number was felt by our focus group to be a good target to try to achieve. There are some component risks within the CARD that are still of concern, one of which is loss of crew during pad abort is 1 in 10. And this number potentially could also be acceptable if the risk itself of having a pad abort is very low, and in the neighborhood of 1 in 1,000. But this number has yet to be determined from the hazard analysis of the launch scenario of the Ares 1 rocket. So loss of crew targets much improved from 1 in 80 is what our focus group wanted to see, and 1 in 200 may be an improved and a reasonable target to achieve with current technology. Now, the other thing that we looked at from a landing injury acceptability was the landing condition and the likelihood of crew injury. Currently, the nominal crew injury risk threshold that's being established for Constellation is 0.5% for a nominal landing, so that crews should not be injured and any more likely than 0.5% of the time with a nominal landing. And we as a focus group thought that was an appropriate number for nominal landing. Now, for off nominal landing, what is an appropriate risk level in case you lost a chute, you came in with 2 instead of 3 chutes, or you ended up way off target and hitting a location that was not intended. And then for those cases, we felt an order of magnitude increase such that the likelihood of an injury risk of less than 5% would be an appropriate value. And these are important numbers right now to Constellation to define because they're very large mission drivers for the Constellation vehicles. All right, the last topic that we touched upon in our focus group was the crew medical officer space surgeon capability definition, and what's the appropriate level of training for that individual. It was felt by the focus group that a physician, an MD, was a preferable individual to have in this position due to the crew confidence an MV, having an MV on board would provide, as well as for the ability of a physician to provide independent operational capability. Now, the training required to do that should include telemedicine capabilities, and it should be considered having an additional person on board, a non-physician CMO, who has the ability to conduct technical activities on board the vehicle in response to a medical contingency, and that the ground guidance would be possible to guide this individual through certain technical procedures when required to assist the physician, or in case the physician his or herself was incapacitated. The last item was that the medical caregiver experience should match the capabilities that they have on board. And those kind of capabilities should include ground specialist consultation to augment the onboard capability, and using telemedicine when required, not necessarily real time, but possibly in a store and forward mode. And so that's a summary of our focus group activity. I know we tackled some tough subjects, some controversial subjects. It's hard to give concrete and I would say binding recommendations, but we think that the recommendations we did come forward with will be helpful to Constellation. Are any other comments from our panelists, our focus group members about these comments? Did I capture our sentiment adequately? Okay, I'm seeing heads nod, so I think we're good. Thank you.
Are there any other comments about the groups or about the panel?
Early in your presentation, Jeff, you alluded to various options about genetic testing and how that may or may not be or should not be used for selection, and that it might also raise issues about insurability of those crew members. This also came up in our group's discussion in a roundabout way, but also in discussions later with colleagues after our afternoon meeting, that if part of data sharing among all international collaborators and in efforts to better assure a safe working environment for future astronauts, we consider changing some of the operational rules about privacy and confidentiality of data. A related concern that we must address is not just insurability of those individuals should their personal information then be made more publicly available, which means insurance companies might get a look at that, but also the issue of perhaps coming up with a system to assure medical care delivery to those people for the rest of their lives, if indeed you are mandating that data be shared. So those are thorny issues, but if we want to maximize our data return from those few individuals who actually get to fly in space, those are related concerns that need to be addressed.
Yeah, why don't you let him comment, and I'll follow it up.
Well, that issue has come up at several points in our meeting here. Some about care of astronauts, the health care of astronauts following their flight careers, and I chaired the Institute of Medicine panel, and I guess it was about 2002 or so along in there, the longitudinal study of astronaut health, and we made several recommendations, but 4 major ones, and that was one of those. To date, that one has really, although there have been exploratory efforts by NASA to get something in place, it's yet to be accomplished. Not that NASA can put it in place, it's a congressional decision to put it in place. But I think we've heard it on several occasions here, and it's absolutely, I agree with you, essential that it get in place, both because it's the right thing to do, and also because it begins to address issues like sharing of medical information that's vital given the small sample sizes that we have.
Well, I would agree with that comment. I think that having a comprehensive medical program for astronauts would be in the best interest, not only the astronauts, but those that provide their care. Unfortunately, right now it is not funded beyond the astronauts' tour of duty. So once they leave the agency, we do have funding to do annual examinations for the longitudinal study of astronaut health. And that is funded for those individuals to return to NASA and the studies that we do in a longitudinal way. However, the remainder of their care is their personal responsibility with whoever their new employer would be or whatever means they would have for providing that care. There is not a funding mandate from Congress to do that additional care beyond their retirement from the agency.
Does anyone know what the risk numbers were during the Apollo program? Comparable
Loss
to
of
what-
crew, the loss of crew risk. Yeah, we tried to look at those numbers, and we think that was probably closer to the current shuttle risk number. They didn't do things exactly the same way in terms of the way they wrote requirements, the way we're writing them now, and having clear-cut defined acceptability limits and thresholds for either loss of mission or loss of crew. However, I'm sorry, Walt, you want to comment?
Yeah, in those days, they talked in terms of mission success numbers and crew safety numbers, and they would like, I think it was 3 nines for mission success, 4 nines for crew safety. That didn't mean a whole lot to us in any way. Subsequent to that time, I think a much more sensible approach is what they've been doing in terms of probabilistic risk assessment, and that's kind of zeroing in on some of these numbers. The probabilistic risk numbers have been actually quite a bit higher than this, proven to be incorrect, and they're making some adjustments. However, I had been asked a number of times what you just asked, and I had guesstimated that it was probably like a 20 probabilistic risk assessment. I've subsequently learned that SAIC did in fact do a retrospective on this, and they came up with either 18 or 20, which would have a lot to do with why they canceled the last 3 Apollo missions. We definitely had the sense at that time that we've gotten away with it so far. Why press our luck? So they have been improving safety all along. I think it was much higher in the days of Apollo than we have now on the space shuttle.
Yeah, and like Walt said, that it was all a systems approach before, where you looked at system reliability numbers, and as long as you had 3 or 4 nines, by the system reliability is felt to be a safe system, especially if you had redundancy. Now we're looking at this integrated probabilistic model where you're looking at the potential for multiple system failures that would lead to either a loss of mission or loss of crew. And the reality is such that we're probably not as safe as we thought we were in the past when you start stacking all the individual risk into an integrated risk. So, there he is, Dr. Petrov.
I fix your attention that we must estimate the exposure of crew member not only in dose. We must use the dosimetric functional that which be used in limits and norms, and we must measure the same values, not measure, estimate. I think it will be possible only estimate, don't measure. But radiation monitoring system must organize the measurement, the physical values enough for estimation, the dosimetric functional, and forecasting this functional for forecasting the possible exposure and taking some special countermeasures. Thank you.
Yeah, just so you folks know, Dr. Petrov is an expert in higher mathematics and has been doing these estimates of risk for a number of years in the Russian program, and trying to make sure that we keep the risk in perspective, because you can be focused on one element and lose sight that there are many systems that need to be considered, and don't overdo it in one and potentially compromise other systems in the process. So thank you for that balance.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you.
We will adjourn for this morning, and the luncheon will be across the way. You go out of the Baker Institute, across past the fountain into the next building, which is a business school. Go down to the rotunda and then turn left. And Leroy Chow is going to be our luncheon speaker, and I think going to give you a very enlightened presentation on the Chinese program, and that he has been visiting with the Chinese and is very knowledgeable of their activities. So thank you all.